The early October air carried a slight chill as Richard Bennett stepped out of his black Lincoln sedan, the soft hum of the engine fading behind him. A light drizzle fell over Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, dampening the leaves that clung stubbornly to the old maple trees. Clutching a bouquet of white lilies in one hand and an umbrella in the other, Richard walked slowly along the gravel path, his leather dress shoes crunching over the wet stones. It was October 12th, always October 12th. For the past 5 years, he had come to this place like clockwork, never missing the date. It was the birthday of the only woman he had ever truly loved, Emily. She had passed away years earlier, but for Richard, the grief never really left. He knelt beside her headstone, the granite now darkened by the rain, and gently laid the flowers down. To the world, Richard Bennett was a name synonymous with success. At 61, he was one of Manhattan's most powerful real estate moguls, with luxury apartment towers from Tribeca to the Upper East Side bearing his signature touch. His face had once graced the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He owned a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a private jet, and a wine cellar stocked with bottles older than most of his employees. And yet, despite all the trappings of success, Richard had never felt more alone. He had never remarried after Emily left. Some said he was too busy, others claimed he was too proud. But the truth was simpler, no one else had ever measured up. Emily had been the only softness in his life, a woman who had seen through the ambition and arrogance to something gentler inside him. She had loved art, poetry, old jazz records, and Central Park in the fall. Where he had built a life out of steel and concrete, she had seen beauty in the small, quiet things. They had met in the early 80s, when he was still trying to prove himself, still taking the subway and working from a tiny office in Midtown. She worked at a small gallery in Soho, always dressed in denim and scarves, with paint smudges on her fingers and a smile that could melt walls. She dragged him to farmers' markets in the village, made him take walks across the Brooklyn Bridge, and taught him that success wasn't about money, it was about moments. But then one day, she was gone. No goodbye. No note. No explanation. He had searched for her, hired private investigators, even flew to Chicago once on a week lead. But nothing. It wasn't until 5 years ago that he found her name in the cemetery registry, too late, of course. She had passed from illness. No obituary, no funeral he was invited to. Just a name carved in stone and 1,000 unanswered questions. As he sat by her grave now, rain soaking the shoulders of his overcoat, Richard realized something that chilled him deeper than the weather. He had everything money could buy except the one thing he had truly wanted. Her. Richard Bennett adjusted the collar of his rain-soaked overcoat as he sat quietly by Emily's grave. The white lilies he brought each year lay at the base of her headstone, their delicate petals trembling in the breeze. The cemetery around him was quiet, save for the soft patter of rain on fallen leaves. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in, made a man reflect, remember, and sometimes ache. He traced her name with his gloved fingers, Emily Carter Bennett, 1962 to 2020. The sight never got easier. 5 years, and the pain still felt fresh, especially on this date. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Richard noticed movement. A figure, slim and slightly hunched against the drizzle, was standing just a few feet away. The young man wore a worn-out brown leather jacket, its collar turned up against the wind. His dark jeans were damp from the wet grass, and his black sneakers were muddied from the walk across the grounds. Richard watched him silently, puzzled. No one else had ever come here. Emily had no close family left, or so he thought. The young man didn't appear to be wandering. He was standing still, eyes fixed on the same grave. Something about his posture felt deeply personal. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice steady but curious. "Did you know her?" The young man looked up. He had striking eyes, a familiar shape to his jawline, a face that stirred something inside Richard, a flicker of recognition he couldn't quite place. "She was my mother," the young man said simply. Richard froze. At first, he thought he'd misheard. The rain seemed louder now, and his heart was beating too hard in his ears. What did you say?" The young man's gaze didn't waver. "Emily Carter. She was my mom. And if what she told me is true, you're my father." The air left Richard's lungs like he'd been punched. He stood there, soaked to the bone, staring at a stranger who, somehow, wasn't a stranger at all. "My name's Ethan Carter," the young man said. "She told me you never knew. That's why she never came back." Richard was speechless. Words caught in his throat as he tried to make sense of the revelation. A son? His son? He had spent decades building towers across Manhattan, signing contracts worth millions, while his own flesh and blood had been growing up without him, without his name, without his support. "Why didn't she tell me?" Richard finally whispered. Ethan gave a slight, bitter smile. "That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself." And just like that, he turned and began walking away, fading into the gray mist of the cemetery, his footsteps soft against the wet gravel. Richard stood rooted to the ground, the headstone behind him, the rain falling harder now. All he could do was watch as the son he never knew existed disappeared into the fog, taking with him a lifetime of unanswered questions, and the faint, fragile hope of something more. Richard Bennett stood frozen in the rain, staring down the path where Ethan had just vanished. The young man's words echoed like thunder in his mind. "She was my mother. You're my father." No matter how many times he tried to replay it, it still didn't feel real. A son? He had a son. The notion crashed over him like a wave, pulling him under, stealing the air from his lungs. He stumbled back slightly, reaching out for the cold stone of Emily's grave to steady himself. For years, he had mourned her in solitude, never once imagining she had been carrying his child, their child, while he built a kingdom of steel and glass. Rain trickled down his face, mixing with the warmth of tears he hadn't realized were falling. He wasn't a man who cried easily. Not in business. Not in loss. But this wasn't just grief. It was guilt. Regret. Shock. A cocktail of emotions he had never prepared for. He turned and scanned the cemetery, hoping for even a glimpse of Ethan, but the boy was gone, lost to the drizzle and gray mist of Brooklyn. It was like something out of a dream, or maybe a punishment he had long deserved. He couldn't just let him go. With sudden urgency, Richard rushed toward the cemetery's gate, his shoes slipping slightly on the wet pavement. His heart pounded, not from exertion, but from fear. He had already missed 2 decades. He couldn't lose another moment. He spotted the young man walking briskly along the sidewalk just beyond the iron fence. "Wait!" Richard called, his voice breaking through the soft rhythm of the rain. Ethan stopped but didn't turn around. Richard caught up, breathing hard, more from emotion than from the light jog. "Please, don't walk away," he said, almost pleading. "I need to understand." Ethan turned slowly. His eyes were guarded now, walls up again. "Understand what? That you never knew I existed? That my mom raised me alone while you were out there building an empire?" Richard flinched at the accusation, not because it wasn't true, but because it cut too deep. "I swear to you," Richard said quietly, "I had no idea. She never told me. If I had known..." Ethan interrupted, voice laced with anger and pain. You'd have swooped in with your money? Solved it all with a check? Richard shook his head. No. I don't know. I would have been there. I would have tried. Ethan looked away, jaw clenched. She didn't want to be your charity case. She needed you, not your bank account. But you weren't there. Richard could say nothing. There was no defense. No excuse that could rewrite the past. You're right, he admitted. I wasn't there. And I can't change that. But I'm here now. And if there's even a chance, just a sliver, I want to know you. Ethan stared at him, unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away again. And Richard, powerful, wealthy, respected Richard Bennett, stood in the rain, feeling smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. Richard Bennett sat in his high-rise office overlooking Central Park, the city lights flickering across the glass like stars caught in a snow globe. The Manhattan skyline had once filled him with pride. Now it just made him feel hollow. It had been days since that rainy encounter at the cemetery, since he learned the truth. Since he'd seen the look in Ethan's eyes, a mix of anger, loss, and something more painful, disappointment. Richard couldn't stop thinking about him. About all the birthdays he'd missed, the scraped knees, the school plays, the heartbreaks, and small victories that should have been shared. He needed to find him. Richard wasn't a man who waited for fate to work things out. He was a man of action. That same afternoon, he called Robert Vega, a private investigator he had trusted for years, discreet, fast, and always thorough. Robert, I need your help, Richard said, pacing by the window. What are we looking for? Came the calm reply. A young man. Early 20s. His name is Ethan Carter. He said his mother was Emily Carter. She passed away 5 years ago. There was a brief pause. I'll get back to you by tomorrow. True to his word, Robert called the next evening. Found him. Ethan Carter, 23. Lives in Queens, just off Astoria Boulevard. Works part-time at a garage on Steinway Street. He's enrolled at City College, engineering major. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the information. His son hadn't just survived, he had persevered. While Richard had been dining in Manhattan's finest steakhouses, Ethan had been wrenching engines and studying until midnight. Later that night, Richard drove himself to Queens. He didn't send a driver. This was something he needed to do himself. The apartment building was modest, 3 floors, faded brick, a rusty iron gate. The kind of place Richard had long since forgotten even existed. He climbed the steps slowly, heart pounding with a nervousness unfamiliar to him. At the second-floor landing, he knocked. Ethan answered the door wearing a worn gray hoodie and jeans. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw Richard. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply. "I just want to talk," Richard said. Ethan looked like he might shut the door, but then, after a long pause, he stepped aside. The apartment was small and cluttered but cozy. Blueprints and mechanical sketches were tacked to the wall. Richard noticed a stack of textbooks on the kitchen table, thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, and felt a surprising wave of pride. "You're studying engineering?" he asked. "Trying to," Ethan replied. "Working nights to pay for it." Richard felt the familiar sting of guilt. "I didn't come here to judge," he said softly. "I came to understand. To know you. To make up for time I can't get back." Ethan crossed his arms, wary. "That's not how this works." "I know," Richard replied. "But maybe we could start with one conversation. No expectations. Just time. Ethan didn't answer right away. But he didn't say no either. And that, Richard thought, was something. The first time they sat down together outside the confines of Ethan's apartment, it was at a small diner in Queens, not far from where Ethan lived. Richard Bennett, a man who had closed billion-dollar deals over filet mignon in midtown boardrooms, now sat in a vinyl booth with chipped formica, the scent of bacon grease and fresh coffee lingering in the air. He didn't mind. In fact, it felt oddly grounding. Ethan had chosen the place. It was quiet, unpretentious. The waitress knew his name and didn't bat an eye when Richard walked in with a custom-tailored overcoat and Italian leather shoes. They ordered black coffee and a couple of cheeseburgers. Richard couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a burger that wasn't served on a brioche bun. The conversation at first was halting, two strangers bound by blood but divided by decades. Richard asked about Ethan's studies. Ethan replied with short, careful answers. He talked about his classes, how he was working toward a degree in mechanical engineering. He didn't complain, but it was clear the path hadn't been easy. "I do night shifts at the garage," Ethan said, glancing out the window. "Helps with tuition." Richard nodded, absorbing the weight behind the words. He wanted to offer to pay for school, buy him a new car, anything to lighten the load, but he knew better. Ethan didn't want charity. He wanted respect. He had built a life for himself without anyone's help. Offering too much, too soon, would only push him away. "Have you ever thought about working in automotive design?" Richard asked. "With your skills, there are companies that would jump at you." Ethan shrugged. "Connections help." "I don't have many." Richard hesitated. "I know people in the industry. If you ever want me to make a call, no pressure, just support." Ethan looked at him for a moment, then gave a cautious nod. "I'll think about it." That small gesture, just thinking about it, was more than Richard had hoped for. Over the next few weeks, they met a few more times. Sometimes at a different coffee shop near Ethan's campus, other times just walking through Astoria Park. They didn't talk about the past much. Richard wanted to, but he knew it would come in time. For now, they talked about simple things: books Ethan liked, music he listened to while working late, how brutal New York winters could be when the radiator didn't work. With every meeting, the space between them began to shrink, ever so slightly. Ethan started to smile more. He even cracked a joke once about Richard being a Wall Street fossil, which Richard took in stride. After one of their dinners, Richard offered a business card. "No pressure," he said again. "But if you ever need anything, guidance, or reference, I'm here." Ethan took the card but said nothing. As they parted ways that night, Ethan glanced back just once. That single look told Richard all he needed to know. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a beginning. The early spring sun had just begun to warm the air when Ethan brought it up over coffee one Saturday morning. "I've been thinking about going back to Chicago," he said quietly, stirring cream into his cup. "I haven't visited Mom's grave since the funeral." Richard set down his mug, feeling a shift in the air. He knew how hard it was for Ethan to talk about Emily, her memory still a wound, tender and unresolved. "That's a good idea," Richard said gently. "And, if you'd like company, I'd be honored to come with you." Ethan hesitated, clearly surprised by the offer. But then he gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "Yeah. I think she'd be okay with that." They flew out that Friday, arriving just after noon. Richard hadn't been to Chicago in years. The city was bustling as always, its blend of old architecture and Midwest charm standing in contrast to the steel and speed of New York. But this trip wasn't about business or sightseeing. It was about closure. They rented a car and drove to the quiet cemetery on the city's north side. The clouds were low and gray, and a soft wind carried the smell of early blooming lilacs. Richard followed Ethan along the gravel path until they stopped in front of a modest headstone tucked beneath a silver maple tree. Emily Carter, beloved mother, dreamer, and friend. 1962 to 2020. Ethan stood silently for a while, hands deep in his jacket pockets, eyes fixed on the stone. Richard hung back, giving him space. He watched his son kneel, brushing leaves away from the grave, his lips moving softly. "Hey Mom," Ethan whispered, his voice barely above the wind. "I'm doing okay. I'm figuring things out. I'm working hard, school's going well, and I met him. I met Dad." Richard's chest tightened. He felt the weight of every missed year, every birthday, every scraped knee, every sleepless night that Emily had endured alone. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "He's not what I expected," he said, this time louder, as if speaking to both of them. "But he's trying. And I think you'd be okay with him being in my life." Tears prickled Richard's eyes, but he blinked them away. This was Ethan's moment. He had come to say goodbye in a way he hadn't been able to at the funeral. And somehow, he was offering Richard a thread of redemption in the process. After a while, Ethan stood, brushing dirt from his knees. He turned to Richard, his expression softer than usual. "Thanks for coming." "Always," Richard replied. As they walked back to the car, the silence between them felt different, not heavy, but healing. On the drive back through the streets of Chicago, Ethan spoke again. "There's this pizza place my mom used to take me to when I was little, Deep Dish, near Lincoln Park. Want to check it out?" Richard smiled. "Lead the way." And just like that, a journey that had begun in grief was starting to look a little more like something else: connection. Back in New York, life settled into a new rhythm for Richard and Ethan. Their interactions, once cautious and brief, began to take on the shape of something steadier, something familial. What had started as hesitant conversations in diners or parks now turned into regular dinners, phone calls, and the occasional shared baseball game. They weren't exactly a picture-perfect father and son, not yet, but they were learning. One moment at a time. One Saturday afternoon, Richard invited Ethan over to his Fifth Avenue penthouse for dinner. He didn't want it to feel formal, so he skipped the hired chef and decided to cook himself, or at least try. He managed to boil pasta and heat up a jar of sauce. It wasn't gourmet, but it was real. Ethan showed up wearing a hoodie and jeans, looking amused when he saw Richard in an apron. "Didn't take you for the stovetop type," he said with a smirk. Richard laughed. "Desperate times. I figure if we're going to build a relationship, we might as well start with carbs." As they sat at the dinner table, the conversation flowed more naturally than either of them expected. Ethan talked about his classes at City College, how thermodynamics was giving him grief, and how one of his professors had encouraged him to consider research. Richard listened, genuinely fascinated, offering encouragement without interference. Then, over a glass of iced tea, Ethan looked up. "I've been thinking about interning this summer," he said. "Maybe, at your firm." Richard paused, surprised, and cautiously hopeful. "Really?" Ethan nodded. "I know I said I didn't want handouts, and I still don't. But I want to learn, and I figure there's no better place to start." Richard tried to hide his excitement. "That's a great idea. But just so you know, you won't get special treatment. You'll earn everything, like everyone else." Ethan smiled. "Wouldn't want it any other way." By the time dessert rolled around, a store-bought apple pie warmed in the oven, their banter had started to sound like something familiar. Like two people who had known each other longer than they actually had. Over the next few weeks, Ethan began shadowing different departments in Richard's firm. He sat in on meetings, asked questions, and stayed late to observe how deals were made. To everyone's surprise, he wasn't just the CEO's son, he was sharp, curious, and driven. One evening, after a long day at the office, Ethan stopped by Richard's office before heading out. "You know," he said, "I used to wonder a lot about who you were. If you even cared that I existed." Richard looked up, heart tight. "And now?" Ethan shrugged. "Now, I'm starting to think you might actually be someone I could call family." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. As the elevator doors closed behind Ethan, Richard sat quietly at his desk, overwhelmed, not by numbers or deals, but by something he never thought he'd have. Hope. The summer sun poured through the windows of Richard Bennett's penthouse, casting long golden streaks across the hardwood floors. It was late afternoon, and for once, his desk was clear. No contracts, no calls, no urgent meetings. Instead, a different kind of milestone awaited. Ethan was graduating from City College. Richard had cleared his schedule weeks in advance. He had ordered a tailored navy blue suit, not for himself, but for Ethan. The young man had initially protested, "I've got one that works fine," but eventually accepted, rolling his eyes in mock reluctance. The ceremony was held at a large auditorium on campus, buzzing with proud families, bouquets of flowers, and camera flashes. Richard took his seat early, near the front. When Ethan's name was called, Richard stood and clapped until his hands ached. Watching his son cross the stage, shaking hands with the dean, holding his diploma, Richard felt a kind of joy he had never known in all his years of building skyscrapers. Afterward, they took photos on the lawn. Ethan's smile was genuine, if a little shy, and when Richard put a hand on his shoulder, the gesture wasn't stiff, it was natural. That evening, back at the penthouse, they celebrated with a simple dinner, Ethan's favorite, grilled steak, mashed potatoes, and chocolate cake from a bakery in Queens. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. No guests, no speeches. Just the two of them, talking about the future. "I've been offered a spot in the product design team," Ethan said between bites. "Your firm. They want me to help develop the new sustainable housing model." Richard raised his eyebrows, pleasantly surprised. "That's a big deal." "I know," Ethan said. "And I want to take it. But not because it's your company. Because I believe in it." Richard nodded, emotion caught in his throat. "You earned that. I'm just glad I get to see it happen." Ethan leaned back, sipping his iced tea. "You know, when I first met you, I didn't think this would go anywhere. I figured you'd show up once, maybe twice, and then disappear." Richard looked at him carefully. "And now?" Ethan hesitated, then smiled. "Now? I think I've got a dad." The words struck deep. Not just because of what they meant, but because of how hard they had been to earn. Richard had spent a lifetime chasing success. But nothing compared to this. Later that night, as the city lights shimmered beyond the windows, father and son sat in quiet companionship. They didn't need to talk. The silence was full of understanding. For all the years they had lost, they had found something rare, a second chance. Richard glanced at the framed photo of Emily on the nearby shelf. "You were right," he whispered. He's incredible." And as Ethan leaned over to grab another slice of cake, laughter in his voice, Richard knew, finally, and fully, that his life wasn't defined by what he had built. It was defined by who he had found, and what they had begun together. At its heart, the story of Richard and Ethan is not just about a lost father and an unknown son. It's a powerful reminder that life often gives us second chances, opportunities to heal, reconnect, and rewrite the ending, even if the beginning was painful. For older adults, especially those in their 50s, 60s, or beyond, this story speaks to something many understand deeply: regret. Whether it's the family we lost touch with, the relationships that slipped through our fingers, or the time we thought we had more of, the weight of what might have been grows heavier with age. But Richard's journey reminds us that while we cannot go back, we can still go forward. It's never too late to reach out, to listen, to say the words that should have been said long ago. Another profound message is the idea that love isn't shown through wealth or grand gestures, it's shown through presence. Ethan didn't need Richard's money, he needed his time, his honesty, and his willingness to show up. As we age, we're often tempted to solve problems with convenience or resources. But sometimes, what our loved ones truly need is simpler: a call, a shared meal, a quiet walk together. The story also reflects the power of forgiveness, not just forgiving others, but forgiving ourselves. Richard could have let guilt define the rest of his life. But instead, he chose to face the uncomfortable truth and do something about it. That kind of courage is what transforms pain into purpose. For anyone who's ever felt the sting of a missed connection or the ache of an unresolved past, this story offers a gentle encouragement: reach out. Pick up the phone. Write the letter. Visit the place that's been tugging at your heart. Because even after years, sometimes decades, bridges can still be rebuilt. As we grow older, our greatest legacy isn't in what we've built or earned. It's in the relationships we nurture, the healing we allow, and the love we choose to give, no matter how late it may seem.